Hey yo, it's me, Factor and Frank, back talking to you about completing the square. Now here's a question. What type of construction are dogs good at? Roofing! Ayo!
When solving a quadratic equation, the first thing you always do is look for a greatest common factor to factor out. The second thing, after you've factored out that GCF, you're going to use a method below to factor and then use the zero product property. So here we've already talked about how to use difference of squares, perfect square trinomials, the magic X. We'll get to factor by grouping next, but these things we've already talked about. You factor, then you use the zero product property and solve for your X's. But let's say factoring doesn't work. You aren't able to factor. Well, if factoring doesn't work, you have two other options to solve your quadratic equation. You can complete the square, or you can use the quadratic formula. So today we're going to talk about completing the square. Now, standard form of a quadratic equation, we should already know this. It's ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c are real numbers. A cannot equal 0, but b and c can equal 0. Now let's review a perfect square trinomial. So a perfect square trinomial occurs when you square a binomial. So here you can see we have binomials, a plus b and a minus b. And if you square them and then FOIL that out, what you end up getting is a perfect square trinomial right here. So you see a perfect square trinomial. It's three terms, 1, 2, 3. The third term is always positive. So for both of these, you can see the third term is positive. The first and last terms must be perfect squares. So I can take the square root of the first and last terms. And the middle term is 2 times the product of a times b. So the middle term is 2 times the square root of the first term times the square root of the last term. And notice the difference over here between a plus b squared and a minus b squared is this sign for your middle term. So whatever that sign is, that's what this guy is going to be over here. It's going to be very important that you know how to factor a perfect square trinomial today. That comes into play when you are completing the square.
Hey, how did the electrician feel about her surprise party? She was shocked. Ayo! Example time.
Okay, example 1 says find the value of c such that each expression is a perfect square trinomial. So here, what you're going to do is you're going to find your b value. So in this case, our b value is this positive 10 right here. We're then going to divide that by 2 and square it. So 10 divided by 2, does that go in evenly? Yes, it does. So that's going to give you 5, and then 5 squared is 25. So 25 is the value of c that would cause this to be a perfect square trinomial. If you were to factor it, that would turn it into x plus 5, the quantity squared. Over here, g squared minus 17g plus c. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my b value, which is negative 17. I'm going to divide it by 2 and then square it. So negative 17 divided by 2, does that go in evenly? No, it does not. So what I'm going to do instead is just leave this as a fraction. I'm going to square my numerator and denominator. So what's negative 17 squared? That's going to be 289. What's 2 squared? That's going to be 4. So that is the value of c that would cause this to be a perfect square trinomial.
Why didn't people like the overconfident bathroom remodeler? He was too cocky. Ayo! You try.
Okay, again, you want to find your b value, which in this case is negative 16. We're going to take that, divide it by 2, and then square it. Negative 16 divided by 2, does that go in evenly? Yes, it does. You get negative 8, and then negative 8 squared is 64. That means that your c value 64 would cause this to be a perfect square trinomial, and that would factor, if you were to factor it, into x minus 8, the quantity squared. Now here we have q squared plus 5q plus c, so we take our b value, which is 5, we divide it by 2 and square it. So is 5 divided by 2, does that go in evenly? No, it does not. So we're going to leave this as a fraction. We're going to square the numerator and denominator separately and just leave it as a fraction. So what's 5 squared? That's 25. What's 2 squared? That's 4. So 25 over 4 is the c value that would cause this to be a perfect square trinomial. Now let's talk about solving quadratic equations by completing the squares. So, given the quadratic equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, if you want to solve this by completing the square, you're going to subtract c to the other side of the equation. So, if you are given a quadratic trinomial already and you can't factor it, what you're going to do is you're going to take the c value, move it to the other side. So, we subtract that to the other side. You're then going to divide everything by a because you need your a value to be 1 if you're completing the square. It makes it a lot easier. Then, you're going to add b over 2 squared to both sides of the equation. So this is basically what we're doing. We're finding our new c value. So whatever b over 2 squared is, that's going to be what you add to both sides of the equation. You're then going to factor the perfect square trinomial. So on this side of the equation, you should have a perfect square trinomial that factors into something plus something squared or something minus something squared. And then you could square root both sides to get rid of the squared. then you just create two separate equations and solve for the two solutions. So let's show you how this works. Example 2 says solve the equation by completing the square. If necessary, round to the nearest hundred. So here what we want to do is we want to solve by completing the square. We're going to find our c value and move it to the other side. Oh, it's already over there. Cool. Next, we're going to take our a value, which is 1, and divide everything by a. Done. If you divide everything by 1, it's still the same. Sweet. Next, you're going to take your b value, which is 8. You're going to divide that by 2 and square it. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. We then take that value and add it to both sides of the equation. If we simplify this side over here, what ends up happening is we get 196. On this side, we have a perfect square trinomial. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted, because now we can factor this. It's going to factor into one parenthesis with this sign, the sign of your middle term in the middle, and it's going to be the square root of this, okay, and the square root of this, 4. So it's going to be k plus 4, the quantity squared. That's how you factor a perfect square trinomial. Now all you have to do to solve for k is square root both sides, because if you square root a square, those cancel each other out. But don't forget, because we have a variable being squared, when you square root this, the other side you have to put a plus or minus to account for the positive or negative version of k. So let's simplify this. The square root and the square cancel each other out. Over here, the square root of 196 is 14. So now what I can do is I can create two separate equations. Remember, this is plus or minus 14. So I need to create one equation where it's k plus 4 equals 14, and one equation where it's k plus 4 equals negative 14. I'm going to solve those separately. So over here, to solve for k, I subtract 4 on both sides, and I get k is equal to 10. Here, I subtract 4 on both sides, I get k is equal to negative 18. So my two answers are k is equal to 10 and k is equal to negative 18. You can always check your answers. So take 10, plug it in for k here and here. Do you get 180? Yes. Take negative 18, plug it in for k here and here. Do you get 180? Yes, you do. So those both check out. Same thing here. First, step 1, move my c to the other side. It's already there. Perfect. Step 2, divide everything by a. Well, my a value is 1, so if I divide everything by a, it stays the same. Sweet. Step 3, take my b value, which is negative 4. Divide it by 2 and square it. So what's negative 4 divided by 2? That's negative 2. And what's negative 2 squared? That's 4. So now all I have to do is take that 4, my c value, and add it to both sides of the equation. When I do that, over here, 165 plus 4 is 196. Over here, I now have a perfect square trinomial. It's going to be one parenthesis. In the middle, it's going to have this sign, the sign of your middle term, so a negative, so it's going to be a minus in the middle. And then it's going to be the square root of this, p, and the square root of this, 2. So it should be p minus 2, the quantity squared, equals 196. If you don't remember how to do this, remember, you can always just use a magic X and you'll factor it just fine. Now, what we can do to solve for p is we're going to square root both sides. Remember, when you square root a variable that is squared, on the other side, you have to put a plus or minus. Here, the square root and the square cancel each other out. Here, the square root of 196 is going to be 13, so we get plus or minus 13 on this side. Now, to finish solving this, we set up two equations, one where p minus 2 is equal to positive 13, and one where p minus 2 is equal to negative 13. We solve each of these, so over here, add 2 to both sides, get p is equal to 15. Here, add 2 to both sides, you get p is equal to negative 11. So those are your two answers. Don't forget, you could always check your answers by plugging these back into the original equation.
Where does a raven go to drink? At a crowbar! Ha ha ha! You try.
Okay, doing the same thing. So step 1, move your c to the other side. Done. Step 2, we're going to divide everything by a. Done. Step 3, take your b value, which is 14 in this case. Divide that by 2 and square it. So what's 14 divided by 2? That's going to be 7. And then 7 squared is going to give you 49. So we then take that 49, add it to both sides of the equation. We simplify this over here. Negative 48 plus 49. Oh, that's easy. That's just 1. Now we need to factor this guy right here. This is a perfect square trinomial. We're going to use this middle term in the middle of our parentheses. It's going to be the square root of this, which is x, the square root of this, which is 7. So it's x plus 7, the quantity squared. We then solve this by square rooting both sides. Anytime you square root a variable that is squared, you need to put plus or minus on the other side. Here, these cancel each other out. On this side, the square root of 1 is 1, so we get plus or minus 1. We now create two separate equations, one where x plus 7 equals 1, and one where x plus 7 equals negative 1. We then solve this by subtracting 7 on both sides, and we get x is equal to negative 6. On this side, we subtract 7 on both sides, we get x is equal to negative 8. Those are your two answers. Remember, you can always take those, plug them back in for x, and see if you get negative 48, which you do. On this one, step 1, add c to both sides, or subtract c from both sides. Done. Step 2, divide everything by a. Well, your a value is 1, just like it was over here. So when you divide everything by 1, doesn't change anything. So we're done. Step 3, we are going to take our b value, divide it by 2, and then square it. So what's negative 2 divided by 2? That's negative 1, and then negative 1 squared is positive 1. So we add that to both sides of the equation now. Over here, when we add that, that's just 324. Over here, we now have a perfect square trinomial that we can factor. It's going to be 1 parentheses. It's going to take the sign of our middle term, so it's going to be a minus in the middle. It's going to be the square root of this, which is r, and the square root of this, which is 1. So r minus 1, the quantity squared, equals 324. Remember, you can always factor this using magic X if you forget the perfect square trinomial rules. Now, we can solve this by square rooting both sides, right? We need to get rid of the square, so when we square root both sides, anytime you square root a variable that is squared, the other side has to be a plus or minus. Now, what is the square root of 324? That's going to be 18, and remember the square root and the square here just cancel each other out. Now we have r minus 1 is equal to plus or minus 18. We create 2 separate equations, one where r minus 1 equals 18, one where r minus 1 equals negative 18. Here we're going to add 1 to both sides. We get r is equal to 19. Here we add 1 to both sides. We get r is equal to negative 17. Those are both your answers. Again, you could check each of these by plugging them back into the original equation and seeing if you get 323, which you do. Example 3, doing the same thing. So step 1, we need to move our c to the other side. Oh, this time they didn't do that for us, so we got to do that. So we're going to subtract 6 from both sides of the equation. When we do that, these cancel out. Over here, you just get negative 6. Now, we're going to divide everything by our a value, which is 1, so that doesn't really affect the problem. So we move to step 3. We're going to take our b value, which is 5, divide it by 2, and square it. So what's 5 divided by 2? Does that go unevenly? No, it does not. So we're going to leave it as a fraction. So we just square the numerator and the denominator. So 5 squared we know is 25, 2 squared is 4. So this is going to be the c value that we add to both sides of the equation. Now what we need to do is simplify this side of the equation over here. So negative 6 plus 25 over 4. Remember, we need to make these have a common denominator. So negative 6 over 1, we multiply by 4 over 4 to get negative 24 over 4. Now we can add these together. Negative 24 over 4 plus 25 over 4 is going to be positive 1 over 4 on this side. On this side, we have to factor this perfect square trinomial. So we're going to take the sign of the middle term that goes in the parentheses in the middle. It's going to be the square root of this, which is b, and then the square root of this. Now the square root of 25 over 4, to do that, all you have to do is just take the square root of the numerator and denominator. So that would be 5 over 2. So that's how you get b plus 5 over 2. The quantity squared is equal to 1/4. Now to solve for b, we square root both sides. Remember, anytime you have a variable that's squared and you square root that, you have to put plus or minus on this side. Here, the square root of 1 over 4, again, to square root a fraction, you just square root the numerator and denominator separately. So what's the square root of 1? That's 1. What's the square root of 4? That's 2. So now that we have this, it's super easy. We just split it into 2 separate equations, one where b plus 5 over 2 equals 1/2, and one where b plus 5 over 2 equals negative 1/2. On this side, we subtract 5/2 from both sides, and when we do that, 1/2 minus 5/2 is going to be negative 4/2, which is negative 2. On this side, you subtract 5/2 from both sides. Negative 1/2 minus 5/2 is going to be negative 6/2, which simplifies to negative 3. So your two answers, believe it or not, are b equals negative 2 and negative 3. Again, you could check your answers by plugging those back in up here and seeing if you get negative 6, which you do for both of them. Okay, so for part B, we're doing the same thing. Step 1, subtract your c value to the other side. Done. Step 2, divide everything by your a value. Oh, we actually have an a value this time. It's 5. So we divide everything by our a value. Now over here, these cancel out. In the middle, this turns into negative 3/5 n. And then over here, this just becomes 5. Now we can move on to step 3, which is take our b value, divide it by 2, and square it. Okay, that'll be a little interesting this time. So our b value is negative 3/5. We're going to take that, divide it by 2, and then square it. So how do you take negative 3/5 and divide that by 2? Well, dividing by 2 is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal of 2, which is 1/2. So negative 3/5 times 1/2 is going to give you negative 3 over 10. So then we just have to square that. So to square negative 3/10, you just square the numerator and denominator. So negative 3 squared over 10 squared. Now, what's negative 3 squared? That's going to give you 9. What's 10 squared? That's 100. So 9 over 100, or 9/100ths, we're going to add to both sides of the equation. Now, before you freak out, it's going to be okay. It's going to all work out because at the end of the day, this says, if necessary, round to the nearest hundredth. So you're actually going to use your calculator for this one a little bit more. So 5 plus 9/100ths. Well, how do I add these together? Well, you need a common denominator, right? So 5 over 1, I'm going to have to multiply the numerator and denominator by 100. So I end up getting 500 over 100. 100. Now I can add these together, so I just get 509 over 100. On this side, I have created a perfect square trinomial. That's what all this was about. So I can create a set of parentheses. This middle sign goes in the middle of my parentheses. The square root of n squared goes first, that's n. The square root of 9 hundredths goes second. What's the square root of 9 hundredths? Well, you square root the numerator and denominator. So you get 3 over 10. So it's going to end up being n minus 3/10 the quantity squared. And that equals 509 over 100. All right, cool. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to solve for n. So I need to square root both sides of the equation. Remember, anytime you square root a variable that's squared, on the other side you have to put plus or minus. On this side, the square root and the square cancel each other out. I get n minus 3/10. On this side, 509 is not a perfect square. So what I do instead is I just square root the numerator and denominator. The denominator, the square root of 100, that is a perfect square, right? That's 10. So I get the square root of 509 over 10, and it's plus or minus. I now create two separate equations, one where it's n minus 3/10 is equal to positive rad 509 over 10, and one where it's n minus 3/10 is equal to negative rad 509 over 10. I then add 3/10 to both sides of the equation over here. I plug this into my calculator, rad 509 over 10 plus 3 over 10. That's going to equal approximately 1.96 because I'm rounding to the nearest hundred. Here I add 3/10 to both sides. In my calculator, I put negative rad 509 over 10 plus 3/10. I get approximately negative 2.56. Those are my answers here.
What's an astronaut's favorite tool? An orbital sander! Ha ha! You try.
Okay, doing the same thing. So first, step one, want to move my c to the other side of the equation. So negative 28, how do I move that? I add 28 to both sides of the equation. On this side, these are going to cancel each other out. This just turns into 28. Now, step two, I divide everything by my a value. So my a value in this case is 1, so if I divide everything by 1, it doesn't affect the problem. So I move on to step three. Step three is to take my b value, which is 1, divide it by 2, and square it. So what's 1 divided by 2? That's just a half, so I'm going to leave it like that. I square that, so I square the numerator and denominator. I get 1/4. Now I'm going to take this is my new c value, so I add that to both sides of the equation, because whatever you do to one side, you got to do to the other side. Now, what I can do is I can simplify this over here. 28 plus 1/4. In order to add these together, I have to change 28 over 1, so it has a common denominator with 1/4, so I just multiply the numerator and denominator by 4, and I end up getting 112 over 4. Now I can add these together. I end up getting 113 over 4. On this side, this is a perfect square trinomial, where my middle term, I'm going to take that sign, so it's going to be a plus in the middle of my parentheses. The first term is going to be the square root of t squared, which is t. The second term is going to be the square root of 1/4. If I square root 1/4, I just square root the numerator and denominator. I get 1 over 2, which is 1/2. So this, if I were to factor this perfect square trinomial, it turns into t plus 1/2 the quantity squared. Now that equals 113 over 4. So to solve for t, I square root both sides. Anytime you square root a variable that is squared, you got to put plus or minus on the other side. Next, to simplify this over here, I square root the numerator and the denominator. So the square root of 113, that is not a perfect square, so I'm just going to leave it the square root of 113. The square root of 4, though, I know is 2. So this becomes plus or minus rad 113 over 2. Again, over here, the square root and the square cancel each other out. Now let's split this into two equations, one where t plus 1/2 equals positive rad 113 over 2, and one where t plus 1/2 equals negative rad 113 over 2. We then subtract 1/2 from both sides of the equation. In your calculator, you plug in rad 113 divided by 2 minus 1/2 equals approximately 4.82. Over here, subtract 1/2 from both sides. In your calculator, you put negative rad 113 over 2 minus 1/2. Press equals, and you end up getting approximately negative 5.82. Those are your two answers rounded to the nearest hundredth. On this side, go through the same steps. Step 1, move our c to the other side. Already done. Step 2, we're going to divide everything by our a value. Oh, we got an a value that's not 1, it's 2. Perfect. So we divide everything by our a value, which is 2. We then simplify, these cancel out, this turns into 4, this turns into 5. Oh, that's nice. Now we take our b value in step 3, we divide that by 2 and square it, so our b value is negative 4. We divide that by 2 and square it, so negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2, and negative 2 squared is 4. Ah, no fractions this time, that's nice. So now we take that 4, we add it to both sides of the equation. On this side, 5 plus 4 turns into 9, and on this side, we have a perfect square trinomial. In order to factor this, you could use the magic X, or you could just remember that it's going to be one parentheses, The middle sign, or the sign of our middle term, goes in the middle of our parentheses. It's going to be the square root of this, which is q, and the square root of this, which is 2. So it's going to be q minus 2, the quantity squared. Now what we do is we go ahead and square root both sides of the equation. When you square root a variable that's squared, these cancel out, and on this side you have to put a plus or minus. Square root of 9 we know is 3, so this is going to be actually pretty easy. We split these up. Q minus 2 is equal to 3, and q minus 2 equals negative 3. Now we go ahead and add 2 to both sides of the equation over here. We get q is equal to 5. On this side, we add 2 to both sides of the equation. We get q is equal to negative 1. We could always check these answers by plugging them back up here, see if we get 5. Now, a word problem says you are filling a rectangular swimming pool. The length of the pool is 3 times longer than the width. The depth is 4 meters longer than the width. The amount of water needed to fill the swimming pool is 288 times the width, measured in cubic meters. Find the dimensions of the pool. So step 1 in a word problem, we're not scared, we can do this. Step 2 is to define our variables. So how do we define our variables? We need to figure out what is the question asking us. Well, it's asking us to find the dimensions of the pool. So we're trying to find length, width, and height, or in this case, depth. So how do we label those then? Well, instead of just doing length, width, and height, L, W, and H, why don't we look at the problem? Well, the problem says the length of the pool is 3 times longer than the width. So because we know this, we can actually write the length in terms of the width. So let's say the width is X or W, whatever you want it to be. We're going to say X in this case. The length of the pool is 3 times longer than the width. If we said the width is X, then the length would have to be 3x, because that's 3 times longer than the width. Then how about the depth? The depth is 4 meters longer than the width. Not 4 times, just 4 meters longer than the width. So we take our width, which is x, we add 4, and that's our depth. Sweet! Now we have just one variable to deal with. That makes it a lot easier. So we can take those, label our figure over here. We have our depth, our width, and our length. Awesome. Now we can create our equation. This is dealing with volume because it's dealing with the amount of water needed to fill the pool. So we say the volume, V, is equal to length times width times height. Now we're going to plug in what we know. We know that x is the width, so that's going to go in here. We know 3x is the length. That goes in here. We know x plus 4 is the height or depth in this case, so that goes here. We also know that the amount of water needed to fill the swimming pool is 288 times the width. So that is the volume. So if we take 288 times it by the width, which in this case is x, that gives you the volume in cubic meters. So let's say 288 times x is gonna be our V, our volume. So we plug those in. Now all we have to do is simplify and solve for x. So let's simplify this. What's 3x times x? That's 3x squared. And now I have to multiply 3x squared times this x plus 4. So I distribute. 3x squared times x is 3x cubed, and then 3x squared times 4 is going to be 12x squared. Now again, we're solving for x. So here, there's an equal sign. So what I can actually do is I can divide everything by the same number. So is there a number that goes into 3 and 12 and 288? Yeah, 3. So I can divide all of these by 3. They also all have an x. So I can divide everything by x as well. So let's go ahead and divide everything by 3x. If I do that, these simplify to 96 is equal to x squared plus 4x. Now this is way more manageable to deal with. And I can use the completing the square method to solve for x. So let's do that. Here, I move my c to the other side. It's already there. I divide everything by a. Already done. I take my b value, divide it by 2, and square it. So what's my b value in this case? Well, it's a little flip-flopped, but my b value would be this 4 right here. So I take that, divide it by 2, and square it. What's 4 divided by 2? That's 2. And what's 2 squared? That's 4. I then take that value and add it to both sides of the equation. Over here, this becomes 100. Over here, this is a perfect square trinomial. So I need to factor this. How do I factor this? Well, I could use the magic X, or I could remember my shortcut, which is create one set of parentheses that's squared. Inside those parentheses, the middle term here, I take that sign, put it in the middle. I square root the first term, that's X. I square root the last term, that's 2. So I get X plus 2, the quantity squared. Now to solve this, I square root both sides of the equation. Anytime you square root a variable that is squared, you have to, on the other side, put a plus or minus. So here, the square root and the square cancel each other out. On this side, the square root of 100 is 10. So now I create 2 separate equations, one where x plus 2 equals positive 10, and one where x plus 2 equals negative 10. Notice that I flipped the equation. You can do that. It's not a big deal. Here, what I can do now is subtract 2 on both sides of the equation. I get x is equal to 8. Over here, I subtract 2 on both sides of the equation. I get x is equal to negative 12. Now, we look at our problem. We can't use both of these because if you look, X is the width of the pool. Can you have a width of the pool that is equal to negative 12 meters? No, that doesn't make any sense. So this is not your solution. This over here, X equal to 8, is your solution. So we can take 8, plug it in here, gives us the width. If we take 8 and plug it in here, 3 times 8 gives you 24. That's the length of the pool, 24 meters. If I take 8, plug it in here, 8 plus 4 equals 12. That's 12 meters. That's the depth of the pool. So now I know the dimensions of my swimming pool, a width of 8 meters, a length of 24 meters, and a depth of 12 meters. Those are my dimensions.